What I'd like to do is actually start by building on some of Peter's remarks. We see consumerization as a journey. And when you look at this journey, it is about 10 years old right now. BYOT, as we call it, bring your own technology, is in the middle of the journey. It's here. Important steps that have occurred before that include consumer broadband. That was important because it was the first time people had a better IT experience at home than in the office. It really changed their perception about the IT department. The iPad was another game changer because it was the first time executives were bringing devices to work and telling IT, not asking, telling IT, make it work with my email, please. So this is a journey that we're on. BYOD or BYOT is the step that's here now, but it's only in service of something bigger and something that will continue. So it's important to remember that this is a continuing journey and that BYOD or T needs to be part of that. So we actually see the model having 6 major components. Peter touched on some of these, but just to review the ones that are in addition to Peter's remarks, one is a move to an outside-in model. We'll talk more about this, but basically we do see the architecture of IT and the architecture of the business going from inside out to outside in. And I'll put more color around this in a minute. The second point, anytime, anywhere, do what I want to do. I think you've heard that before. The third point about a bias for differentiation is new. I think we've been on a journey towards standardization, and standardization is important, but there's something beyond standardization. So parts of an organization have different risk profiles. They have a different appetite for risk, for variety, need some agility in what they do, and standards sometimes get in the way. So an example of where standards are important, in my opinion, is around document interchange. Everybody should be on the same document interchange software, whether it's Google Docs or Office, don't care, or some other, but everybody needs to be on the same one because you really don't have compatibility across. Now, on the other hand, operating systems, actually, I'm getting pretty indifferent about operating systems. So if you're on Apple versus Microsoft, doesn't matter. It'd be important to have a minimum threshold of that operating system. On mobile platforms, Android versus iOS, pretty indifferent there. So standards are important, but there is something beyond standards that we call differentiation. We like to see assets become self-sufficient, more do-it-yourself, people taking care of their own needs. One, because they can. 2, because it can actually save the firm money. Security we see as not only technology, but it's about people and processes as well. And Doug's going to spend more time on this in a few minutes. And then finally, the last component in the model is about leveraging the external marketplace. And the example that's front and center in many of the firms we're consulting with now is email. So I would say in the last year, the business cases that I have done, and these are for mid-sized to large enterprise, the business cases that I've done have shown that actually email can now be provided on the outside cheaper than on the inside. It's become a commodity. There's very little upside from a financial standpoint in doing your own email. Companies may choose to continue to do their own email for other reasons, but if you're saying that you're doing it because you're saving money, I would be hard-pressed to see that in a robust business case. Peter talked about our millennial. You can see ours has multiple arms, doing multiple things at once, and we'll come back to him later on. So this is our attempt to really describe outside in versus inside out. And to give you just a broad definition of what we mean by outside in, Outside in says that a device initially, or a person initially connects on the outside, and they stay on the outside unless they have a compelling reason to come inside. And what's left on the inside are the special sauce applications and services of the business, which would include manufacturing. It would include other applications that the firm decides are important to retain in a protected environment. It would include the servers, storage, routers that are at the center of the firm. But it would not include things like a laptop. So the problem with the laptop is actually they're quite risky. And they get carried in, they get taken out of the firm, the USB ports are live. So while we don't mind seeing a lockdown device, a truly lockdown device on the inside, a laptop that can be moved around the organization and moved around the world is something that we don't condone being placed on the inside of the firm. Put it on the outside. If it needs to come in, it's got to authenticate, it's got to prove that it has integrity, and even then I might only allow it to use a remote control feature through the DMZ. So this is our notion of outside in. This is both a technical architecture as well as a business architecture. So one of the things we do see happening is more and more use of inter-enterprise processes, inter-enterprise collaboration. Firms need to talk to people in other firms. And in many cases today, they're doing that by letting those JV partners or contractors or vendors inside. They're saying, well, the best way for us to collaborate with you is we'll give you access to our inside services, be it email, SharePoint, whatever. Better answer is leave them on the outside. Say, you know what, we'll communicate with you on the outside, we'll collaborate on the outside. There's no need to let you come into our key assets because we've actually shrunk our perimeter and we're limiting what's going on the inside to really the fundamental secret sauce of our firm. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Doug.
Thank you, Jim. Jim and I have been talking about this sort of thing for more than a decade. And we've talked to a lot of companies, and we asked them, what's your policy on employee devices, or what's your policy on employee use of software like R that they might want to use? And for the longest time, we would get an answer of, well, we really don't have a policy. And we finally learned that, in fact, everyone has a policy about employee use of technology. It's called Don't Ask, Don't Tell. In marketing, in the plant, in lots of places, people are doing things. And the problem with Don't Ask, Don't Tell is that you never cut a deal with the person as to what they could do. You never made it clear there were some responsibilities. Because we think that bring your own device, bring your own technology is all about what you can do now that you have this stuff. It's not about the device, but it's about acknowledging that there's a quid pro quo that you've now taken on some responsibilities. Some of the things that we've run into are particularly what the user agreement covers, questions about contractors that Jim just mentioned. That's a good place to start. We think that there are issues about how do you run the financials. So Cardinal Health, for example, set up a deal in which they took away the paid BlackBerries, let people buy their own phones, but they covered the data plan. So there are a lot of sort of merged kinds of activities. We see an important idea of segmenting the workforce. We think there's roughly a 20-60-20 breakout, that there are 20% who are ready to do stuff, and our job as IT is to get out of their way. And there are 60% that are kind of looking, seeing what's going to happen to the first 20% and want to be taught, and we need to provide some training. This one size doesn't fit all becomes really important because what I like and what you like could be quite different. We think that training is really going to be an important part of this, particularly training around security. Anybody think security is getting easier? Okay, so we all know it's getting harder. It's getting harder because some security people might say the attack surface is getting bigger. We're using technologies that let us work with people in other countries and other companies. We have much more data than we ever had before. I mean, you can just do a litany of all the reasons why this is an issue. And then you have stories. Anybody see the New York Times story about 45 pieces of malware that hit them? Yeah? And how many of them were blocked by their vendor, Symantec? 1. Does that give you a pause? Or how about the fact that in the beginning of January, the Department of Homeland Security said, you know, you really should disable Java on your machine? Java. That was going to be the be-all and end-all for everything. And then yesterday, it looks like there's another flaw with Acrobat. Now, a lot of these are called zero-day vulnerabilities, which is they just appeared. There's not a fix for them. There's not a workaround. So what do? Well, first of all, as Jim suggested, we take and we shrink the perimeter around the things that are really important. And we begin to tag data differentially. So stuff that's really important, we tag and we take care of. And stuff that's not so important, we don't worry about. So I'm not going to be worried if you have some low-level data on your mobile phone. I may get concerned if you want to have real strong secret stuff on your phone. I might do as one company did, say, you can have access to this, Doug, but if you do, you take upon yourself a burden of responsibility that may be heavier than you want to carry, because you could get fired if this gets out. Do you still want it? So again, what's the quid pro quo? The other thing that Jim mentioned is when I talk to security people, and I'm not a security person, I don't claim to be, but I am a social scientist, and so I like to look at things and observe. And I observe that when I talk to security people, they say it's people, processes, and technology. And as a social science guy, I think that's about the right thing and about the right order. But ask yourself, of all the security people you've ever met, how many of them had any training or indeed interest in people or process? So there's a piece missing. And let me give you some thoughts about where we might go with this. DuPont is famous for its safety. Jim here was at DuPont not long ago doing a workshop, and afterwards he's walking down a spiral staircase and he's kind of tap dancing his way down the staircase because it was a great meeting. Left hand has a briefcase, right hand has an overnight bag, and out of nowhere comes a gray-haired woman grabbing his hand, putting it on the railing, taking away his briefcase, saying, now you be safe. No joke. So how do we do that with IT security, and how do we do it in less than 200 years, which is what it took DuPont to develop? We think that there's some things to be done with social media that can help in that regard. And then consider investigating a company called Bromium. One of the things we do in the Leading Edge Forum is for our clients, we do study tours. We take 40 people out to various countries or companies, and we visit upcoming companies. And one of the ones that really got our attention this last October was a company called Bromium. Now, what's special about them? Well, Bromium is from the people who invented the Zen hypervisor and sold it to Citrix for $500 million. So these are pretty smart cookies. 2 years ago, they started saying, what if we could make it the case that when you're using your web browser, for instance, on the web, and you open a new tab, that tab executes in its own micro virtual machine where it's isolated from everything else, and we can actually watch to see if it does something bad. And if it does something bad, we control it, we freeze it, we maybe keep it later for replay. And that's what they've done. So they actually don't try to block things because that's not going to work. We know the game is now detect and react. But what they do is they say, we're going to run stuff in a VM, and that means that we don't care whether it's a vulnerability we know about or a zero-day. So things like Stuxnet, which scares me to death because it had 3 0 days in it, we think now this is the first step that we think can actually handle 0 days. And there's some evidence of it. And what happens when you do this is that it actually keeps a log of what happened to the virus, because actually it has a complete log. The virus thinks it's executing perfectly, but it's in a micro VM detached from everything else. So just to finish up, the other thing that we're currently researching is gatekeepers. Inside all of your companies, you've got people that do things like HR and legal that keep people from doing stuff. Jeff Bezos, in his recent SEC filing, said the gatekeepers make sure that innovation doesn't happen, because they eventually tell people, you can't do that, it won't work, and often enough it does. But when we put people outside, what happens to the gatekeepers? Many of them don't even know what's going on outside. Jim, for example, had a problem at BP with SAP Dev and Test. He wanted 5 servers to do SAP Dev and Test. And he figured out that the cost of actually the process of ordering the 5 servers was going to cost more than the servers themselves. So what did he do? Well, we got him hooked up with Amazon early days. This was 2006. They were able to build something and charge it to his corporate credit card, and the cost was so low, it never hit the threshold of procurement. Now that's kind of cool, but it probably would have been useful for some other people to know about it. So we have this issue that we're going to have to sort out of the balance between making things knowable by other people so they can take advantage of it and not slowing people down. And this is an area that we're trying to work on now. So the issue is, this is 10 years old. Why it took so long? Jim?
Thanks, Doug. So Doug's teed up the question, and it is quite remarkable. Here we are 10 years into the consumerization journey, and maybe we're 10% of the way there, maybe. And so we asked ourselves at the LEF, what's so hard about this problem? Why are we moving so slowly on something that appears to be compelling? And what we did is we developed a readiness assessment. So we put an instrument in place with 26 questions asking people why or how ready are you for this brave new world? And what we found is that people were all over the place. We have a database now of 29 corporates that have responded, and those respondents came through with very high scores to very low scores, depending on these dimensions that we were assessing. Let me give you one example of a dimension which I think seems quite subtle. Here they all are, by the way, just so you can see the 26 things that we actually score against. But the one I want to talk about is the charging mechanism. So one company that I worked with actually did pretty much everything right, except their charging mechanism did not incentivize a move to consumerization, or BYOD for that matter. So in fact, the benefits of BYOD were flowing back to the entire organization. It was getting smeared, as we say, and so everybody was seeing some minor cost savings as a result of it. But the early movers were actually having to pay more in order to achieve consumerization. And so when we ask about this particular question, here's the 29 respondents. Scores of 7 and above are good scores, and as you can see, there are only 6 of 29 scores. 6 companies of 29 that were happy with how their charging algorithm was impacting their move to consumerization. The rest either were unhappy or kind of in the middle. But this one factor alone is getting in the way of progress for many firms. So the readiness assessment is a way to determine, okay, what do I really have to worry about? What changes are occurring that are going to materially impact my ability to succeed in getting to this brave new world? And remember that consumerization affects everybody in the firm. It is the biggest change project in my 40-year career that I've seen in IT. Some general observations from the readiness assessment. We saw very low self-reliance today. So even though the millennials and even some of us older folks can take care of our own equipment, either we were not allowed to, or we just found it easier to call the help desk. Authority and accountability are often mismatched, particularly in large matrix firms where the group responsible for rolling out, let's say a BYOD program, may not have as much authority as they need to roll it out. So they're being held accountable without sufficient authority. We did find that IT is under enormous pressure to change. So not many firms are happy with where their IT departments are today. Chief Information Security Officers, key players. Security really matters, whether you're talking about BYOD, outside in, do it yourself. Getting the CISO on board is really important. Talked about charging. We talked about third-party access. That's gaining in importance. Most firms do measure user sat. We found that in firms where not only was it being measured, where it was affecting the bonus of the IT function, then it was really important for them to improve user sat. I'd like to talk for a minute about the business case, because in most firms, a lot of time is spent trying to figure out, is this move to BYOD going to save the firm money, or is it going to cost us money, or am I doing it for some other reason? So we've developed an instrument that lays out a number of different ways of looking at the business case, from a baseline to what we call a projected reference case, and this refers to changes that are already in train for the existing model. And it also takes into account the fact that vendors, oftentimes when they recognize you're about to move to something like BYOD, that they will come in with a new price sheet. So it may impact their help desk revenue if you go to BYOD, because you're going to do more self-support. So you know what, we can save you some money. Top-down business case leaves all the stranded costs in. The bottom-up business case does not. And an example of that is your Exchange servers. So if you're going to third-party for email, what do you do with the depreciation on your Exchange servers? If you're going to leave it in the business case, that's a top-down case. If you're going to, in effect, put it to the side, that's a bottom-up case. That's more of a greenfield case. And then finally, we do have a best practice number, and this came from a consulting firm that does track who really is doing BYOD and consumerization most effectively. And this is a real example of a firm where we did do a business case, and as you can see, the 5 different bars reflect that baseline, the projected reference case, significant savings when they moved to a consumerization model, but even more dramatic savings when they went bottom up. So remember, that's the greenfield case, and that was a case that was the only one that beat the best practice case. This is a subject that gets a lot of debate when we develop business cases, which is, are we strictly talking about money? Or are there other reasons that we're doing this? And the other reasons typically fall into these 5 categories: productivity, some strategic value that IT is getting out of the business of just supporting the drains, but is going to do more value-added stuff, collaboration, the increasing need to collaborate on the outside, agility, which doesn't get talked about much, but is becoming more important. People want their systems to be more agile, to deal with just the clock speed of business and the competitive threat that often causes companies to need to respond, but their systems are not flexible enough to do that. And then finally, we do see security as a source of business value. So when you shrink that perimeter, and when you take the high-risk devices to the outside, we think it actually creates a more secure environment. And then the last subject I just want to touch on is applications. The legacy apps turns out to be one of the toughest challenges in the move to consumerization, BYOD, cloud. And the reason is the business case tends to be unattractive. There's very little upside that can be found in moving that portfolio, and it's expensive. So we've laid out this really simple model that says, here's the potential steps you can take in moving your applications. We start out with a simple option, which is retire the app. Most firms have done enough M&A activity that they have many applications doing the same thing. So pick one, get rid of the rest. And from there, we go to options that cost more, but hopefully you never get to this till this last one, which is where you actually have to write a new app from scratch. So, in summary, segment the workforce. If you want to make this happen, don't try to get to everybody. Find your volunteers. Find that first 20% that Doug talked about. Focus on them. Get your gatekeepers involved. This is legal, HR, procurement, finance. We see some firms where IT is just trying to outrun them. Not a good long-term option in our opinion. Much better to get them at the table and get them into your pilots. Make them part of the BYOD process. And hopefully that will help get them engaged and build their understanding. Emphasize training, not just technical training, but policy training. Here are the new responsibilities that you are taking on as a result of BYOD, for example. Focus on change management. We'd like to see the project manager for something like a BYOD project to report really high in the organization. Sometimes we find them to be reporting really low in the data center. Probably not a good idea. And then finally, the do-nothing option is getting more and more risky. Not a good place to be today, in our opinion. So here's our millennial, last slide, and he's on the train to the future. You can see there's some people that are trying to catch up. They recognize where the future is headed, and they're trying to get on the train. But then there's those folks on the left side, and they don't even realize there is a train. They're just happy with where they are today.